This is the Cloud Security Today podcast, where leaders learn how to get cloud security done. And now your host, Matt Chiodi.
Amazingly, this is our 15th episode. You know, when I started the podcast well over a year ago, I didn't know how long I would do this for. But I can tell you that if you've ever thought about starting your own podcast, I would really encourage you to just do it. I knew nothing at all about podcasting. And to be honest with you, it's not that hard. It is a time investment. So if you've ever thought about it, go out and do it. All right. So today's guest, I'm really excited. He's a special guest. But to be honest, I think all our guests are special. It's Justin Berman. Justin is the Vice President of Infrastructure and IT and the Chief Information Security Officer at 30 Madison. And I wanted to have Justin on because this is an interesting story here, how I first got connected to Justin. I was actually applying for a role at a company he had just left. It was a Chief Information Security Officer role. So I've followed him after that, and I'm just intrigued by his career path. He has spent so much time around startups that with Justin, I didn't necessarily want to dig in specifically around cloud security, but rather how you build security into platforms and products from day one. The other secret that I'll let you in on is that, as you can imagine, I record a lot of these podcasts in advance, and this episode is no different. I originally recorded this episode with Justin back in September of 21. So if there's any date references that seem off, you'll know why. I hope you enjoy the episode. Today's guest on the program is Justin Berman, and we are really excited to have him on. He's currently at 30 Madison. Justin, thank you so much for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here, Matthew.
So tell us a little bit about your current role at 30 Madison. First of all, what does 30 Madison do? I know that you're hiring, so I guess it's actually a couple questions. It's what's your role, what you're focused on, what roles are you hiring for? And fourthly, what does 30 Madison do?
I'll start with the last one first. So 30 Madison is trying to be the place in the world that everybody goes to deal with and manage their chronic care or their chronic health care needs. So, we're not trying to compete as your primary care physician right now. We're really trying to help people that have lifetime health issues manage those health issues in a way that feels as good as it feels to buy or work with an e-commerce company. E-commerce has done a lot of work to try and make their user experience absolutely seamless and beautiful. And so we want to hold that bar for user experience while providing authentic solutions to people's chronic healthcare issues. And my role at 30 Madison, so technically my title is CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, but I think the more accurate title would probably be VP Security and Infrastructure. So my actual role is I'm building out most of the teams that enable scaling. So infrastructure, DevOps and SRE report to me, or what we call DevOps and SRE, call it cloud infrastructure, reports to me. Security reports to me. IT reports to me. Privacy and compliance all report to me. And you asked what roles am I hiring for? The two that stick out the most in my mind right now is I'm looking for very senior product security engineers, and I'm looking for staff level site reliability engineers from my infrastructure team or higher. I mean, I'm happy to find a principal level engineer, but I think the bar we're looking for is staff. Did I answer all your questions? I think I answered all your questions.
You did. You went right through those pretty well. So no, that's great. I love to ask the question about hiring because I know that is something that seems to be perpetual in the security industry. But listening to your kind of the list of teams that report to you as the CISO, that's pretty different than many organizations. So give me a sense for how large is 30 Madison? Like, what are we looking at in terms of employees?
Oh, current total staff is, I think we just crossed the 290 mark. I would have to go look at our actual HR system to tell you the exact number. And then within technology, we're a bit over 130. And then my current teams, hiring aggressively for them, but my current teams, between all of them, are in the 16, 17 range right now.
I think, what I was looking at your background, and I know that, way back when you were an intern at the University of Maryland and you were doing software development. And, looking at your career, it looks like you've pretty consistently been at companies that have software as a product. So I'm always intrigued when I see people who are in security who really kind of grew up through a development background, because that's really unique. It's usually, and I've said this in other podcasts and other places before, but you typically see a lot of people in security who are from a network security background, audit, compliance. So how did that experience shape your then future career in security? And again, I asked it just because it's different than what you see in many that are at the CISO level.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, in a very practical sense, it meant that I started my career more from a AppSec red team side. The first real security job I had was consultative at Aspect Security before they got bought by EY. And, I cut my teeth on finding bugs in custom code. If I reflect, I think it's caused me to have two philosophical stances that I know not all people in security share. One of which is that I think largely I see security as a engineering problem. And what I mean by that is not that there aren't things that you solve with process or with policy or with training, but rather that in as many places as possible, if you want to have a scaled effect within security, you need to write code to solve a problem such that it's impossible for someone to even make a mistake, rather than trying to focus on how do I teach people to make fewer mistakes, or how do I build processes that are more resilient to mistakes. It also, I think, really benefits me. As you said, I've worked for a lot of companies whose products are software-oriented. Those companies put a very high focus on engineering productivity, and coming from a software engineering background and software engineering work, I empathize deeply with that. Having been a software engineer, I know that job is also challenging and also takes a lot of effort and energy. And so I think I see AppSec teams or product security teams that too readily will slow down the engineering community, not really realizing the impact that has. And I think I'm lucky to have the software engineering background, both because it gives me a detailed understanding, but it really gives me empathy for the experience that engineers have and why security can be a challenging thing for them to integrate into lifecycle.
So I don't, and feel free not to answer this question if it's giving up too much, but I assume at 30 Madison, you guys are a cloud company, right? That everything's in one of the big CSPs or one or more of the big CSPs. So everything you're talking about, everything that you're doing is, I'm going to assume, for the most part, cloud native. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I will gladly answer yes, because frankly, I think it is way easier for small companies to buy a bunch of OPSEC, operational security, by using a cloud security company rather than trying to run our own data centers. There's also all kinds of cool security benefits with software-defined infrastructure that I think, because we're cloud native, we didn't have the challenge of becoming a digital company. We were a digital company from the beginning. It means we can build practices in from the ground up that take advantage of the nature of rapidly, creating and destroying infrastructure with repeatable configuration that just take other companies longer periods of time to get to the point where they're comfortable with. So I actually think it offers us a ton of security benefits that far outstrip any kind of security issues that are created, or different security issues that are created within the cloud side.
I'm curious, how much of that advantage, I've spent most of my career in kind of the Fortune 500 space, really large companies, tons of tech debt, right? Just decades of tech debt, which makes the transition to cloud difficult, right? Especially if you're looking at financial services, right? I mean, M&A after M&A after M&A, they're dealing with systems that sometimes haven't been updated in, 30 plus years sometimes. So I'm curious from your perspective, obviously 30 Madison's on a different scope and scale of that, right? You said you've got about 300 employees, but at the same time, you have still a very scaled, very largely scaled platform. So from your perspective, I think a lot of the listeners to this podcast are more than likely, I'm guessing, I don't know all the listeners, I wish I did, but I think most of them are probably from the more kind of the Fortune 500 space. And they're looking at, and they're like, man, I would love to be where 30 Madison is, right? I'd love to be all cloud native. I'd love to have nothing in these 7 colo facilities that still have a lot of mainframes that are, quite frankly, running things. So I guess the question for you is, if you were to give some advice, here are 1 or 2 things that you can look at doing as you transition to the cloud that can maybe set them on a path of thinking about security in the way that you do, which is you kind of build it, right? It's policy as code, it's security as code. Where might you recommend they start? This is going to take time, but where might be some areas you might recommend they start?
I mean, a generic I think on purpose, very generic recommendation. Actually, before I say this, just like I super empathize. When I was both at Bridgewater from a financial services perspective, I was one of the security architects that designed their approach to digital back in 2013. So AWS, much less sophisticated as a platform at the time, but still like really important. And then at Dropbox, we had a hybrid of using both cloud and on-prem. Dropbox, people used to ask me, Dropbox was born in the cloud. And I'm like, no, Dropbox was a cloud, like created a cloud, storing that much user data at the time was not a cost-effective strategy in cloud. Obviously, Amazon continues to be brilliant at dropping the cost of things like S3, Glacier, et cetera. But for Dropbox, creating their own data centers, creating their own systems, and in fact, all the way down to like thinking about custom firmware and whatnot is really critical. So I empathize is my point. When I think about the transition process to cloud, I think the first piece of advice I usually think about is like, you are starting from a green field, treat it that way. Do not simply port things. I mean, it feels like generic advice to me because it's not like, oh, make sure you do this one configuration thing or set yourself up with this particular set of policies. It's not like that, but it is like instead of succumbing to the temptation of simply moving things in place over, which you will have to do sometimes. Like, I think the reality for every company that does a digital transformation is they can't afford to re-architect and rebuild everything from the ground up. But I would start from a place of we should set the right security posture in place and then by exception do something different. And that whole attitude of approaching that project, which for most Fortune 500 companies is many, many, many years and hundreds, at least tens of, if not hundreds of millions of dollars a project. It's like that is a directive at the top of that project that happens, which is like, by policy, we are going to architect it from the ground up in a particular way. Security is a part of that. There are, by the way, reliability things that you can do that make it more effective. There's all kinds of not security and privacy stuff you can do that make the cloud journey better. And knowing and intentionally making the choice to say it will take an exception to build things outside of this architecture puts a sometimes gentle, sometimes severe forcing function on how you move things over so that you don't just slip into being like, oh, well, let's just move it over and then we'll figure it out later, because that just persists the debt and can make it worse. So like, honestly, if I was going to give one piece of advice, it's like start with that direct, like get in agreement at that top side that is the thing. And then as a follow-on in short form, like if you can't do that, like if that's not the thing, then a lot of the biggest mistakes that I think really bite companies as they move from an on-prem to a cloud is that people don't realize how swiftly you can create a world in which all the, let's say, layers of security you used to having in a data center, where you might have like external firewall, routing layer below that, switching layers in between, or further routing layers in between, and additional firewalls in between, like, oh yeah, we have a trust zone for web and a trust zone for apps and a trust zone for databases. And that's like, you can set that up, you can mirror that, but that thing, it's so like one small configuration change can also give your database a public IP with a /0 firewall rule. One mistake can take an S3 bucket and allow public list and get on all files within that bucket. And it's not hard to make those mistakes. And actually, luckily, I think it's not hard to catch them either. I know like lots of different companies have good cloud security posture management tools. So I won't try to like bang through particular solutions so much as just saying like, it's not so much that it's impossible to solve these problems, but that the assumptions we make no longer hold effectively. It is very easy, and in fact more default behavior, that things are directly touching the internet or touchable by the internet, as opposed to what we used to have, which is you have to be explicit about creating a route that actually gets you all the way from like internet to a database, and that requires changes in many layers that a lot of people could intercept and catch. Yeah, anyway, those two, like, and they're really, I guess, like ways of thinking to me, although the first one really is a like get in sync in your project, in your digital transformation projects or program, get in sync at the beginning, we're going to do this right. And then by exception, we're going to do this in a way where we have to create a bunch of compensating controls for a particular thing, as opposed to let's just move it over and figure out how to deal with it, which I've also seen companies do.
I think the point you made there is very valid in that I've seen threat research that came out, I think it was probably a year and a half ago, that said that 65% of cloud security incidents were the result of customer misconfigurations, right? Like you said, it's just the cloud has all these great things that you can do with it. It's scalability, agility, et cetera, et cetera. But that also, like you said, also goes the opposite way, which is you can also make poor misconfigurations, or you can make misconfigurations just as easily as well. So I guess a question for you would be, there has been public examples of both, really large companies that have made those kind of mistakes and also smaller companies that are, let's say, more cloud native. Is it just simply because of the nature of cloud, like things are API driven, and because of the fact that, like you mentioned, perhaps there's not all those layers of governance that used to exist that is leading to that? Or do you think it's more of kind of like a skills mismatch, or is it a combination?
I like that question. I think there's a knowledge mismatch, because I think that a lot of the sysadmins who did great work in traditional on-prem are actually totally capable of doing the skills that they have apply, but there's a whole bunch of new knowledge in order to understand how you implement, say, like a similar control, or how you rethink about a control given the different context that cloud has. So I think there is a knowledge mismatch where, like, you want to upskill your existing people, but there is a period of time in which they don't yet have the cloud knowledge. And frankly, though I like consultants in certain cases, rarely do I think you can have a consultant design a strategy for you in a tech context and have that be super effective. Hot take, I guess. But I also think that part of that stems from the fact that the complexity of infrastructure as code, or rather I should just say the complexity of configuration-driven, software-defined infrastructure is not low. I think this is true even in like platform as a service and software as a service things, because I'll tell you, like, to pick on them, not because I think they're doing a bad job. I think they're going out of their way to do a good job, but it's still hard. Salesforce is like somewhere between that platform and software as a service offering, depending on the thing. And there are so many ways just to configure identity and authorizations within Salesforce that have non-obvious overlapping implications. And I think the same thing can be true within, say, like IAM policy within AWS or their competitors, Azure and GCP. So some of the problem is raw knowledge, just like, hey, understanding how cloud behaves, how you expect it to behave. Some of it is, frankly, that like the level of choice that you have, the flexibility offered in order to make these things usable by everyone, even when you're not talking about infrastructure as a service, even when you're talking about these more restrictive systems like platform and software as a service, is just so high. So the potential for mistakes is higher, and the velocity with which a mistake propagates is very high. That to me is reflective on like why you can see mistakes that are avoidable in cloud create issues for a lot of companies, especially if I'm thinking about the point you were making before in the digital transformation side. I think for cloud native companies, there's like a whole different set of challenges, which is like they often are at the bleeding edge. They're trying to move with incredible velocity. Infrastructure is a supporting function that is likewise trying to move with great velocity to empower the engineering community at the company. And often there is a bias in cloud native companies to allowing your, say, like application engineers to also affect cloud, like the infrastructure itself. And in that case, you have someone, I actually think that comes back to the knowledge thing, although it's from a different angle. Like when you have a software engineer who's spent their life building front-end code and you tell them like, okay, great, like go set up whatever EC2 instances you need for your front-end app. It's like, that's not really fair. They might have that experience, but chances are they don't have all the experiences they need. And at 30 Madison, I see that as a responsibility of the infra team to provide, productize the infrastructure for the engineers so that they don't have to think about it. It's not about, I don't want to allow them to ever care about it. It's about making their jobs easier. But when I come back to like where do cloud native companies make mistakes, it often comes from a fact that I think they're expecting people who don't really have that much understanding or experience to make these decisions rapid fire as they roll out products. And that trickles back into like if you ask someone to make a decision with insufficient knowledge, they're less likely to make the right decision.
No, I love that.
I could belabor that point for probably a long time.
No, I think that's some really great insights that I've not heard before. And you touch on another area, which is just, from what I have seen, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, DevOps teams, historically speaking, are really focused on moving fast, breaking things, and security traditionally has really felt the weight of trying to then manage that resulting risk, right? So you, I think, are in a unique position in that it sounds like you've got both of those teams reporting to you. So how do you bring those two together? Like, what have you found that really works from a security and risk perspective in terms of allowing them to move fast, right? Hit their sprint goals, but at the same time, not allowing the risk to be beyond what I guess is acceptable to the business?
So one quick clarification. Our application engineers do not report through me, but our infrastructure teams do. So when I think about the full DevOps, like ideology is expressed in things like the Phoenix Project and whatnot, there's still, I don't think we have a fully DevOps model where every developer is a full ops engineer and whatnot. We still are trying to offer an infrastructure as a product internally within the organization. So splitting the different parts of the problem, I actually think my infra teams want to move fast, but are relatively security cautious in the way that they behave. They would rather take a little more time, get more advice from the security team, work in more partnership. And frankly, in terms of the culture at 30 Madison, because we're dealing with health information, my engineers in general want to move they want securities advice. I have more trouble keeping up with the requests than I do trying to get people to pay attention to us. That's a luxury that I know not every security team has. But when I think about enabling product development across the entire SDLC to move quickly and effectively, and in fact, security first, philosophy and then specific ideas here about tactics. Security's job is not primarily, if you measure security only on number of vulns shipped or number of vulns that we find in prod, which I think is a useful metric, but if you measure it primarily there, then you miss half the equation. Security's job is to establish a bar for what's acceptable risk with, and it's my job to work with leadership to help normalize that bar, tolerance, all that stuff. And then security's job is to make it easy to hit that bar. Not drop the bar, but make it easy to hit the bar we say is secure enough. And so if we reframe security's job that way, then we start to think about, well, what can I do at scale across engineering? So instead of asking the question okay, well, how do I find all the bugs and make sure that the engineers get all the bugs so that they go back and fix all these bugs and all the security debt, which is also a necessary set of vulnerability management practices, you're going hey, we have all these, this is not an issue at 30 Madison, but I'm going to pick this class because it's easy to talk about and everybody seems to know what SQL injection is. If you have pervasive SQLi, you can go fix all those bugs, right? You can go ad hoc, fix one by one, whatever. But if the security team stops there, then they've failed the DevOps cycle. What they should be doing is going hey, we fixed all these bugs, but holy shit, why do we introduce so many of these? And do we need to overload the functions associated with our SQL? Do we need to set up linters? Well, actually, I'll say it. If you think about crawl, walk, run, crawl is I find the bugs, maybe in prod, I hand them to developers, they fix them. Walk is I find the bugs during dev, during commits and pulls for code, and I hand them to the developers there. Run is I wrote a library, I overloaded a function, I built a service that prevents developers from ever having to worry about SQL injection, again, because it makes it impossible, as long as they use the service, library, function, etc. And then, by the way, you also make the rest of your job about finding the problems easier because you can start asking the question, did they use the service we built? Instead of asking the question, is this particular chunk of SQL vulnerable? So when I think about tying back to the empathy for the developer, I want them to have to think less about the security world writ large and more about the unique problems within their product. Where can security build things that abstract away problems is, to me, the way you at scale solve in a certain company size, right? If you're a 30 business unit 10, 15, 17, or 10, 15, 30,000 person shop, like that may not work. Although I know there's some tech companies that have like done this. Good examples in my mind, both Uber and Slack have really invested very deeply into what I'll call like security software engineering. There's like a lot of tech companies or tech forward companies that have made the decision to invest in software engineering as a part of the security team, or software engineering as a set of solutions that security, say like tech product manages. And that is how you actually like shift from, oh my God, the development teams make so much change and I can't keep up with it, into, yeah, I'm eliminating whole classes of issues because we're actually building a solution that prevents the possibility of introduction of those issues. And I can sort very easily on when are you not using our solutions, when are you using our solutions. It's also like there's a lower false positive rate to that answer, which has like a massive impact on the like work lives of your AppSec and product security engineers. Because if all they're doing is spending all their time going like, oh man, I got to look at another line of SQL and like figure out if this particular one, that's a lot longer of a threshold than them being able, and because they don't want to ship a false positive to an engineer and have that engineer turn around and be like, what is this bullshit? Excuse my language, I guess, for your podcast. If you can authoritatively say like, hey, you didn't use the function, that's a 0-1. Like either they did or they didn't. Then they might have a good why, but that's like a very easy thing for you to like sort through and push to engineering as being like, hey, we set the standard, we solved these problems for you. Why didn't you want to use our solution? We might need to evolve our solution. We might need to do something different. But like your job as an AppSec engineer becomes, you get rid of the bottom classes of problems and get to focus on what's really interesting, I think, in product security, which is like, hey, where's there unique stuff in our products that doesn't exist everywhere else? Like, I don't want my AppSec engineer to focus on what are the like XSS issues, because frankly, like that should be solvable. I'd much rather them go like, oh, what are the fraud issues? What are the like unanticipated consequences of our users trying to abuse our products? Like, what are we doing to prevent account takeover? Like the stuff that is specific to your business in both risk and solution.
No, I love that. Prisma Cloud secures infrastructure, applications, data, and entitlements across the world's largest clouds, all from a single unified solution. With a combination of cloud service provider APIs and a unified agent framework, users gain unmatched visibility and protection. Prisma Cloud also integrates with any continuous integration and continuous delivery workflow to secure cloud infrastructure and applications early in development. You can scan infrastructure as code templates, container images, serverless functions, and more while gaining powerful, full-stack runtime protection. This is unified security for DevOps and security teams. To find out more, go to prismacloud.io. You know, you've touched on a couple of things there, but I think if we go back to when we were talking about many organizations, you know, not being born in the cloud, are now in this process of digital transformation, where they're looking at their portfolio of applications, whether it's, 10 or 1,000, and they're saying, hey, some portion of these, they're going to go to the cloud and we're going to completely refactor these apps. They're going to be made cloud native. So I think that presents a unique opportunity for those, let's say, larger, more mature companies to really start to build security into the actual software that's being built, the app that's being built. Now, you've done this, I think, in a number of companies, right? As they've kind of built and scaled their platform. Certainly you're doing it today at 30 Madison, but I think you've touched on some things that I think can really help to make sure that it's actually built in. Because what we've seen, historically in the past was that, organizations would have to take some kind of legacy application and they'd have to kind of bolt on all these different security tools like WAFs, et cetera, right? All over the place. So what have you seen? What have you done in the past that has worked well in terms of building security into the actual application? Like, this is not how in the traditional enterprise, they usually didn't think that way, right? You had the app and maybe you ran some kind of static code analysis. And if you got really crazy, you did like dynamic analysis, right? But that's like the beginning and the end. So what have you seen work well in terms of like, if someone now has this opportunity, they're going to be building, whatever n number of apps, they're refactoring them to be cloud native. What are some things that maybe they should be looking at to try to build it actually into the actual application?
Yeah, I think if we're talking about actual refactors, and so we're scoping out legacy apps that are never going to get revisited from a software engineer perspective, because I think in those cases you really are trying to ask the question, like, how can I put the right kind of walls around this if I need to bring this into cloud and expose it in new ways, and I'm not going to really do much dev, then you really do have to think about, like, okay, if I can't touch the thing, like, what do I touch around the thing? And I think there you're thinking about, I think about things like identity-aware proxying or zero trust, like, stuff. I do think about WAFs. It's like, limit who can touch a thing more. I think incident response becomes a critical part of your security posture around applications that are like that legacy side. Not that it isn't for the rest, just that, like, you start to rely on it more because you believe that you can't make as many changes, so you at least want to be able to respond rapidly when bad things start to happen. If I'm moving an application that, like, I guess it depends on, like, the degree of debt and the degree of re-architecture the company has an appetite for. Because if it's like, hey, we're going to move it to the cloud, but we're really going to try and keep app code the same, then I think, or as much as possible, keep it the same, then I think you're looking for the gates. I don't mean security gates. I mean, like, access gates. So, like, are the assumptions you were previously able to make about authentication a thing that's going to hold? Are the assumptions about who can touch this thing, I don't just mean who can post-auth touch it, but, like, pre-auth, what, like, does it require some kind of, like, network restriction to actually access the application? If you're thinking about internal applications, like, I have seen companies move a, like, admin app to public web, sometimes for good customer service-oriented reasons where they want to have, like, more flexibility about where their CX agents live. God knows in pandemic world, we have had a whole different kind of lift with regards to, like, suddenly companies have tens of thousands of people on VPN when it used to be hundreds of people a day. But if there's low appetite, then it's like, I would focus on attack surface reduction. I don't mean that on just, like, every vulnerability is attack surface. I actually mean just, like, how can you put barriers in between the adversary and the first touch of the application where they could even spend time doing vulnerability discovery work on that application to try and find a bug that would actually give them what they want, or the underlying infrastructure, right? Like, there's not, wherever possible, like, don't put a server directly on net, like, put it behind a load balancer so that someone has to pass through these things unless there's additional gates. And, like, you can put, you know, your WAFs in, like, application load balancers and whatnot to try and bolster defenses. I don't think WAF's a panacea, but I think it's, like, it is a logically useful part of strategy when you're trying to defend applications that you don't want to heavily invest into. If you're going to totally rewrite the book, then, like, what are the security invariants you need? So, like, you know, you need to be able to prove identity. You need to be able to, like, prove authorizations. You need to be able to audit. And, like, any one of those things is a library. And if it's not a library, then a bunch of engineers are rebuilding a thing over and over again that really should be built once, audited heavily in that one build place, trustworthy for the organization, and then used consistently. So if you're going to convert, that's the place, is, like, spend a bunch of time getting the controls that enforce the core security invariants right, and then that gives you a foundation that is very strong to work off of, as opposed to a world in which you're still playing whack-a-mole with bugs everywhere. You may have to do that thing, by the way. I'm not saying, again, it's like, it's always a yes and, but it's like, how much energy do you put in the different places? Like, I put more energy into fixing things at scale than I put to, like, getting a little bit better at finding bugs. Like, if I've done my 80-20 on finding vulns, like, probably the majority of attackers aren't going to go past that 80-20 unless I'm, you know, certainly your Fortune 500 companies, they're screwed. They're, like, facing every adversary in the book. But, like, for a lot of the smaller companies, they can say, like, I'm 80-20 good at finding vulnerabilities. If I can prevent these kinds of things, whether from being introduced in the first place, which is the ideal, or at least prevent their exploitation, then, like, I have probably a reasonable risk posture, and then do that prevention in a library form, as opposed to doing that prevention in the form of, like, just reminding engineers to get better at not introducing SQL injection or XSS or whatever. Yeah, I think that there's, like, a whole different thing, which is, like, which we probably don't even have time to go into right now, but is, like, about another conversion that companies try to make at the same time, which is monolith to service to microservice transitions. Because I think the world of security, I mean, it is hard at best to reason about the security of a complex system. And when you have microservices that each have their own assumptions. If there's not a framework that you're working in that declaratively says what the assumptions about security all microservices must make and what the invariants they must enforce are, then like it's very hard, if not impossible, to reason about a specific trace all the way from like one side of the front end application through the like end microservices it touches to the data layer. It becomes like any one of those could inaccurately enforce the invariants. Any one of those places could inaccurately enforce authorizations or authentication, could fail to audit, could like return data that it shouldn't. And so I think that thing is probably equally, if not more challenging for organizations to go through than the conversion of like, this is in an on-prem data center to like, this is in, AWS, GCP, Azure.
So recently, the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, they started cataloging cybersecurity bad practices. So I'm curious, from your perspective, you've been doing this long enough now. When it comes to cybersecurity bad practices in, let's say, DevOps teams, what do you commonly see? I don't know if you can think of a top 3, but what does that look like from your experience?
I don't know whether it's fair to call this like a DevOps team thing. I think I'm going to say at a company level, I still see the same security gaps that I saw when I started my career back in like the mid 2000s, which is like inventorying is hard. People don't do it very well. Patch management and vulnerability management is hard. People don't do it very well. Basic controls for AAA, I don't actually think are as hard, but people don't do them consistently. So like, I wish we were in a world in which those things were just like solved for at this point. It feels like they should be commoditized. It feels like they should be easy to solve for. But the reality is it's still hard. I actually think cloud makes it a little bit easier. At least on the inventorying side, you can get authoritative, accurate inventory from a cloud system about what you have in it. But I think until those problems are no longer things that are, let's say, immature within an organization, you're really aiming too high if you can't solve those problems. And I still see so many companies that can't solve those problems effectively or consistently that, yeah, I can come up with some like very cloud specific, like these kinds of misconfiguration mistakes get made, etc. But honestly, like basic vuln management, basic patch management still bite so many companies, still cause so many big breaches that it's like hard for me to want to recommend anything other than like get this right. And then we can talk about like all the other cooler stuff or more interesting or challenging to solve security problems that emerge beyond that. And by the way, getting it right in cloud, I think is in many ways for many people more doable. Like the AAA side of things, whether at the like infrastructure layer or within the applications, is a thing that you can enforce with consistency, right? Like, for example, using AWS because I know more about it than GCP, and so I can talk about specific things. Like you can turn on CloudTrail, you can turn on guard duty on top of CloudTrail, and immediately, I mean, you can turn on a few other things too, and then you immediately get like a meaningful amount of logging of all the actions that are occurring, and suddenly you go from like, I didn't have reasonable auditing to like, no, it's not perfectly complete. I don't have every piece of data that I need. Like my IR team is certainly not going to be satisfied with just CloudTrail and guard duty, but like, wow, I have a meaningful start to that control, and then I can evolve from there. In cloud, I can literally call an Amazon API and spit out a list of everything within my organization. And in terms of the vuln patch management thing, like I think the opportunity here is like you can get coverage that is hard to get otherwise. Like traditionally, we have like agent-based and network-based vuln scanners, and they like maybe catch everything and maybe don't, and maybe you didn't keep them up to date. But like when they can just pull off an API and say like, what are all the systems? And I need to scan all those systems. And then there's like another API that they can be granted access to that allows them to run commands on all those EC2 machines. Talk separately about the like concern that might create, but like you can get a level of coverage and information in a short period of time that when I think back to trying to help secure or build those kinds of controls in on-prem systems with more traditional technology, it's just like leagues easier. This is like, do these things in cloud too. And you can do these things more right in cloud more easily. So do that first, and then we can talk about like all the cool whiz-bang things that you might want to do beyond that.
It sounds like, from what you're saying, and I love the kind of the knowledge that you've imparted to me and both the audience, but it sounds like you're saying that, if someone's listening to this and they are in Fortune 100, Fortune 500 type of company, that it really is about fundamentally changing the approach, that your default way of getting security when you move to cloud shouldn't be, hey, I need to go buy a security product, but first I need to fundamentally think just, how do I build security into this from the start? And maybe that is a security product, but that shouldn't be the end goal. Does that kind of sum up what you're...
I 1,000% agree with you. I think one of the biggest challenges I've noticed, just like self-owning here, one of the biggest challenges I've noticed that people have when reporting to me is I put so much emphasis on start with why. And a lot of people come to me with like, I want to buy this tool. And I'm like, why? And they're used to just like, not having to answer that question, or like it's self-obvious to them. Now, I do it to the people that work for me because in part, like I'm trying to prepare them for the reality of like talking to other people outside security, because I expect partnership between security and the way they solve problems, and engineering and infrastructure and IT and HR and finance and all these other teams. But it's also because like I think we too often get focused on buying a tool instead of asking ourselves like, what are we trying to achieve? Why are we trying to achieve that thing? And then how is a separate question from that what and why. Because what is engineering really? Engineering is measure what you want to get better, change something that you believe is going to affect that, measure again, and repeat that cycle ad nauseum. Now, I'm oversimplifying that greatly, to be clear. I think in security, we often talk about the whole like OODA loop, like observe, orient, decide, act. But like the idea is the same. It's like the what and the why establish what are you actually trying to affect. When you know why you want to do something and what you're really trying to accomplish in that thing, there's so much opportunity for partnership. I'll give you a very specific example of what I mean. I do not understand why security teams want to run separate log collection anymore. Like, if you are in a company in which there is a monitoring team or a logs team or something like that, they probably run a service that is better than the security team will run. Also, as a CISO, I don't want my security engineers to be sysadmins for, well, I was going to say for Splunk because I have a particular, like it's so expensive to keep up and running. No offense to Splunk users, but like I don't want to pay for my security engineers to be sysadmins. And so like, I don't understand why the default posture is like, oh, we need our own stack. We need our own tools. I can reason about that, but rarely is it because someone's like, I have never yet, without prompting, heard someone come to me and say, we need our own stack. And I say, why? And then they say, because the monitoring team won't give us an SLA that we think is enough for the quality of their tools. No one says that. They're like, because this is a security product. It's not a log thing. And I'm like, it is. I'm not saying you don't need to bolt something on top of our monitoring tools to make it useful for you, but like, why would you want to deal with all the data lake issues that exist? Why would you want to deal with all that like collection infrastructure? Doesn't make sense to me. And that's like coming back to the, what is the capability you want to create? Why do you want to create it? What is the outcome that looks like good enough for you? Gives freedom to security engineers more than anything else to actually solve the problem rather than getting stuck in like, I want to use this tool and then finding that that tool may not solve the problem for them.
I love that. One of the things I have found consistently with high profile leaders like yourself is that, leaders are readers. And unfortunately, I can't claim fame to that. Somebody else said that. Tell us a little bit about what you've been reading lately and maybe, how you found it useful in your role at 30 Madison.
So a couple things. When I think about at the whole book level, I've been rereading Phoenix Project, which if anyone's not familiar is all about like the rise of DevOps and the ideal, at least the like an ideal version of what DevOps means. I've been reading both the Google SRE book as well as a bunch of other writing that exists on the web about SRE and how to think about different ways to like build out reliability over time within an organization, because that's like in my infrastructure team responsibilities to lead that organization. I'm thinking a lot about reliability. Obviously, as a company that serves patients, we want our systems to be extremely reliable. And so for me, like thinking about how do we want to start moving into higher levels of maturity there? How do we want to invest resources into moving the bar there, et cetera, makes a lot of difference to me. And then the other one that sticks out to me as a book that I well, actually, I'm going to say as an author, because I like almost all of his work, is when I think about the raw leadership side of things. This isn't a security book. Everything Simon Sinek writes, I like. Leaders Eat Last is probably my favorite book of his, but I think that basically everything he writes about is fundamentally about what it means to be an empathetic leader that generates real outcomes with people at the center, as opposed to seeing people as just a tool. He's very motivational. He's very good at bringing people on a journey. And I think that that's a thing that I'm always trying to get better at. I'm always trying to think about the way I can tell not the right story from I want to tell the facts to everyone, and I want to help them understand those facts, because not everyone hears the same data and understands it the same way. So it's I want to help my engineers understand the facts of the situation in a way that makes them effective. I want to help the managers that report to me understand the facts in a way that makes them effective. I want to help the peers in the organization, the other directors and up and VPs and such, make the right decisions. I want to help our senior leadership team make the right decisions about a specific set of facts. And so I think a lot of Sinek's work is really good about helping people go through journeys and helping them understand, and his understanding of storytelling as mechanism for communicating the right information is so important.
So, Justin, I've just loved this conversation. We've covered so much. If people want to connect with you, maybe they want to learn more about 30 Madison and the roles that you're hiring for, where should they go to do that?
You're welcome to DM me on Twitter. I'm at Justin M. Berman. You're welcome to find me on LinkedIn. I'm Justin Berman on LinkedIn. You're welcome to, I'm not going to give my email out because I know that's going to turn into a bunch of vendor spam.
Yes.
And I'm not going to give my phone out. You are welcome to apply through our careers page, 30madison.com/careers. But I am happy to talk with anybody who wants to talk to me directly as well.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today, Justin. I know that a lot of people are going to walk away from the podcast just, really with a change of mindset, I think, around how to build security into products to start with. Thanks for joining us.
I appreciate that so much, Matthew. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode. To find out more, please visit us at cloudsecuritytoday.com.